So Wuthering Waves is coming out in like less than a month, and I couldn't be more excited. Seeing Kuro games put their combat into an open world setting is something I felt that I've always needed. Though, I have to say, the content circulating Wuthering Waves right now is a bit odd, especially with the strange speculative tier list that magically popped up even before the game release. Some of these tier lists are all over the place, and it's funny reading the rationale of some people's tier lists, but that's not what I want to get into right now. I just want to talk about Wuthering Waves combat and where it seems to stand for the game itself. More specifically, it's about a concern rooted from some of the comments that I've seen a few times over in my About PGR combat video that really made me think about how some would receive Wuthering Waves combat. The comments I was referring to were the ones saying that second generation characters in PGR are quite brain dead compared to the first generation. There was a concern that second generation characters may have thrown the challenge of navigating the 3-ping combat system out of the window. And to a certain extent, I don't blame them because I see where they're coming from. But I thought to myself, man, how will they receive Wuthering Waves combat then? I mean, Wuthering Waves doesn't operate on the 3-ping combat system. Instead, it just has a standard attack, a special attack, and an ult going for it. Maybe throw in a heavy attack that does something. It all seems rather simplified on the surface. So, is Wuthering Waves combat system really brain dead? No. Alright, pack it up y'all. I just saved Wuthering Waves. Best game ever and Genshin could never. Oh, okay. Actually, there's a bit more nuance to this. You see, the combat isn't necessarily what I would call brain dead. And there's a chance that at any point we might receive a character whose gameplay is essentially brain dead. And to a certain extent, if executed well, it's not ultimately a bad thing. But that's a hard balance to strike. Because what's important is whether or not the combat is fun, and how do they preserve that fun. Let's step back for a bit and just talk about what it looks like coming from PGR to WoWA. First, let's be honest, I don't think the 3-ping combat system is the friendliest of combat systems to learn in the action combat genre. You're literally playing some sort of Souls-like with a Candy Crush bar attached to it that just so happens to have paragraphs worth of depth if you Candy Crush right. Anyone can make some sort of argument that people just have to dig their heels in and learn the combat system just like any other game. To a certain extent, that might be true. But for an action combat game, especially for a gacha game, I'm sure most people don't really want to interface with a system that sort of needs you to split your brain for two things. And in terms of first impressions, it just comes off as complex, not to be confused with depth, which again isn't exactly inviting. Besides, I already allocated some of my other brainpower to other gacha games as well, so come on, give me some more headspace here. Look, Wuthering Waves combat isn't necessarily brain dead. I used the word simplified earlier to describe the combat, but really, I think a better way to describe Wuthering Waves combat is that it's much more streamlined, coming from a 3-ping combat system now to a set of standard action buttons. For the most part, what we have now is much more accessible to the audience in that it's recognizable and straightforward. But I don't think it came at the cost of its depth at all. And really, they still took some of the combat mechanics from PGR and put it into WoWA. I mean, if you miss paragraphs in your core passives, don't worry, they still exist. It's called Forte circuits, and this time around, they play with the gauge above the character's health bar to elicit unique abilities similar to that of core passive bars that we get from certain characters in PGR. We still have our intro skills, and now there's outro skills as well, but this time they rely on the concerto energy gauge. There's also echoes, which are basically better cubs. Oh yeah, you can't forget about the unique timed attack interactions, like if you time Rover's 4th attack to the light that pops up behind her, she'll do a different attack that deals more damage, similar to how Crimson Weave's Sword Waves mechanic works. So yeah, not all is lost on the altar of simplicity. Now, can you dodge and parry your way to victory with only basic attacks? Yes, but there's also the fact that there are some abilities out there that make the fight less annoying by dishing out more damage, or lowering the stagger bar faster, or protecting yourself in a fight with certain abilities through heals and shields, which honestly are worthless in my opinion. And most importantly, you're probably denying yourself the freedom from looking cool while fighting. The truth is, it's a choice to engage with only part of the system or all of it. And really, the combat as a whole is pretty decent and fun, enough to where it's worth engaging. Overall, this kind of combat is fine, as it still has its depth, maintains the challenge of its content, preserves the fun, and aligns deeply with the core mechanics of the game. And if anything, it probably makes the game better for the future. The way I see it, if we get this kind of streamlined combat, that means that we get a better handle in how much control we have over the combat itself. And to that end, that also means that Kuro can get crazier with their boss design. Basically, more opportunities for us to say skill issue. Anyway, this leads into my next point, which is balancing combat towards the pace of the fight. Now, this is more of a conversation about whether simplifying or streamlining gameplay is good or bad. Here's one aspect I want to offer. The thing is that the state of combat isn't just about what the player can do, it's also about what the game would throw at the player to encourage them to stay engaged. Let's think about it this way. When we look at the combat system from Dark Souls, the truth is, it's pretty simple. You're pretty much dodging or parrying your way to victory, but you get some of the most memorable boss fights ever in its genre. You as a player will already have a good fundamental understanding of the combat system from the get-go, which frees up FromSoft's ability to go a little crazy with their boss design, not just with the spectacle, but also with the challenge. In the gacha space, the easiest example of poor simplification I can think of is Genshin Impact. Its combat system is super simplified, and its depth is really relegated to its element reaction system. Early on, it seems cool, but later its depth started and ended with the element reaction system. Now, there are some characters that have their own unique depth that serves as an exception, but for the most part, you can pretty much brute force with anything in that game with the core mechanic of elemental reactions. Or say screw it, just go raw damage. And that's where the problem lies, because the content, and especially the bosses in the game, don't exactly demand much from you anyway. The situation was made even worse with the introduction of Dendro, where the game just turned into a deranged looking color fest of nonsense that deletes anything your way. Wait, this isn't Braindead. This is just a brainwashing technique. What's worse is that there are fights where they just inflate the HP pool so they don't disappear too fast. And even if you're not using what they want to use, it doesn't matter, because all it really comes down to is just hitting a giant punching bag, which is all spectacle and no substance. You see, the difference between the two games is that in Wuthering Waves, I'm trying to defeat the boss as fast as possible, because the longer the boss is alive, the more likely I'm going to get clapped. For Genshin Impact, the longer the boss is alive, the more I'm wasting my time being bored and hating my life. Another example I want to bring to light is a series that is known to change and streamline their mechanics after every iteration, Monster Hunter. More specifically, the 5th generation of transitioning from World to Rise. You see, the roster of weapons in the game had some divisive changes that made them easier to use in some cases, such as Longsword getting Spirit Gauge faster or Switch Axe getting amped almost immediately through a counter, which some can argue that it would eliminate some of the drawbacks that the weapon had as a balancing mechanism. That said, the depth of the weapons wasn't lost, rather it was relegated to the axis of having more options to express weapon usage through switch skills, which is where I personally believe is a net positive. That said, through the introduction of the switch skills and the wire bug, Rise ended up having a faster paced combat system that was seemingly easier and forgiving. But, in my opinion, that's where the problem lies for that game. You see, when going through Rise, the tools we received to succeed were noticeably easier to use, but at the same time, the monsters in Rise became absolute pushovers to a point where it felt like nothing mattered. I thought for quite some time as to why this was the case, and I later inferred that the reason it felt that way was probably because the pace of the monster, or at least its tempo, did not keep up with the pace of the hunter's updated form of combat. I came to this conclusion because in my confusion, I went back to World to see if I'm actually better at the game, but really, I was confronted with a different truth. In World, the pace of the monster was much faster or much more oppressive compared to what you're able to do as a hunter. It felt like I was always on the back foot in most of the fights, which is where the challenge comes from. In a way, it makes you feel like you're fighting in that monster's world, and that they have the advantage. In Rise, it's the opposite. It doesn't feel like you're going to an enemy's turf to fight, it feels like you're going to pick a fight with someone that was already given a blanket with smallpox, which really had me feeling frustrated about the game. So this goes back to Kuro Games and Wuthering Waves. It seems that they know what they're doing, and they're not holding back on their boss design or challenges. They just want to make sure that a fight is a fight, and that there's no other excuse as to why you suck at the game other than skill issue. All in all, streamlining a combat system isn't bad, and complexity isn't always good. It's about how it's executed within the confines of the game itself. In Wuthering Waves' case, that resides in how the combat ties deeply into the design of the challenges and boss fights. So yeah, Wuthering Waves combat isn't necessarily brain dead, but that doesn't mean that it can be down the line. Maybe in the future we might run into a character that does have that brain dead gameplay, because I'll be honest, some of the later frames in PGR are somewhat brain dead. I know some people from the comment section used Bianca Stigmata as an example, but my example would be Karenina Daybreak. Heck, even in Monster Hunter, one can say that Dual Blades and Longsword are quite brain dead compared to something like Switch Axe and Charge Blade. I mean, come on, spamming or counter-farming your way to victory is pretty brain dead. So, who's to say that it's not going to be the same in Wuthering Waves? But hey, if you like spamming or counter-farming, more power to you. But while you're at it, why don't you spam and counter-farm that like and subscribe button, haha! That said, I feel like all of this doesn't take anything away from the game. Instead, I feel that it leaves more room for Kuro to go crazy with their boss fight design to challenge the player no matter how hard they can cheese it. I mean, there are some boss fights in PGR that make sure you pay attention or else you will eat the dirt. I'm absolutely sure the same thing will happen in Wuthering Waves, especially off the back of everything I've experienced in PGR. I say this with full confidence that Kuro will deliver and make crazier and crazier epic boss fights. Though, we need to be vigilant and keep an eye out for how far the Braindead gameplay can go. We don't want to end up having the stupid boring whale fight in Genshin. Like, oh my god, who thought this was a good idea? Oh, and by the way, a random note to make about Wuthering Waves, and it's really important to me. Recently, some people found out that Jinshi is going to be a playable character. But hey, I already knew that. I mean, how could she not be playable? Anyway, I'm just so excited that at least it was confirmed, I guess. I mean, why in the world would I even want this Carl guy when I can get Luna from Wuthering Waves? So, I know what I'm saving for.